Good morning, everyone. I'm Julia Mendez-Smith. I'm a professor of psychology at UNC Greensboro, and I've been trying to do self-regulation all morning, but I have to tell you that you have to add a G in my email address because I'm not at UNC, and as a Duke grad, it was just really hard to see that in print, so if you need to contact me, go into UNCG in the email, and forgive me for I'm in that territory, right, where we know your identity is very important. I'm also the co-investigator for the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, and I'd like to tell you that the views I'm going to express today do not necessarily reflect the views of OPRE and the federal government. They do reflect my own conclusions about the work and my collaborators, so Natasha Cabrera at University of Maryland, Lisa Janetian at NYU, our partners at Child Trends, and other graduate students and investigators that have been helping us with this work. So to set a context for today's presentation, I'm going to do more of a 30,000 feet overview of what's happening today with Hispanic children who are living in poverty, and then we're going to take a closer look at ECE access for this population, which is what our center's been working on. So the first fact is that presently 1 in 4 children, all US children, are Hispanic. And the second is that most of these children are living in economically precarious situations. About 1/3 live in poverty, and another group are just above the poverty line. Third, the vast majority of children are US born, and they are citizens. Over 90% of children are US born. And fourth, although many of our young children are citizens, the fact is that estimates show about 1 in 4 Latino children are living with a parent that lacks legal status, and we refer to these households as mixed status households. And so as we're thinking about our research, our programs, and our policies, it's really important to keep in mind the diversity of experiences that define Latinx populations in the nation today. In a recent analysis that we did using publicly available data, we found that if you look at 13 states, you can account for about 80% of all low-income Hispanic children. And what's interesting about this is that my home state of North Carolina is on this profile. Many states in the southeast region of the US are experiencing rapid increases in the proportion of Hispanic children that are low income, whereas on this side, you can see the established communities that have been home to Hispanic residents for long periods of time. And so where I live, we're working with communities that are referred to as new emerging destination communities as opposed to established Hispanic communities. And so that makes a difference in thinking about access in the population. So this meeting has been talking to us about adverse experiences, and I just wanted to highlight a few before we get into more of the resilience piece of my work. Many contemporary issues that you've been hearing about in the popular culture have to do with things like immigration policy changes, discrimination, but also how this is impacting the nature of work for Hispanic families, poverty-related stressors, and policy changes that have created really uncertainty and the family separation that we've been hearing about. If you'd like more information on this, SRCD has a great piece on the statement of the evidence about how harmful family separation has been as a policy, and I think, unfortunately, we're really going to pay dividends on this particular ACEs down the line. What I want to focus the talk on are protective experiences. And so at the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, we are taking an asset-based approach to try to populate the research literature with resilience features and strengths of families in economically challenging circumstances. And the idea behind this work is that if we're going to lift families out of poverty, we need to focus on the Hispanic community because the vast majority of children who are being raised in poverty today are from Latinx backgrounds. So some factors that we want to point to, I won't go into all of these for this talk today, but I can direct you to this research, is that we see fairly high rates of marriage and unions among Hispanic families who are living in low-income backgrounds. There's lots of evidence of parental investment. We do it for the children. It's one of the motivating reasons behind immigration, and it's also a family cultural value. We see evidence of rich language inputs and dual language learner homes, which could be treated as an asset in our public schools and not as a deficit. We see very high levels of workforce participation. Unfortunately, the industries and jobs that Hispanic families are taking are very low wage in terms of earnings. So we have to think differently about the economic structures. And then finally, access to ECE, early care and education. And so for the remainder of the talk, I'll be featuring all forms of early care and education. These would be inclusive of center-based care, home-based providers, and informal care arrangements. So in terms of a conceptual framework, ECE access is multidimensional, and it's really not about parental preferences, but it's about coming together to provide parents with reasonable effort and affordable options that permit the child to enroll in a good arrangement of high quality that meets the family needs. And so we use this framework to talk about both household factors and supply factors. I'm going to focus today on the household side, but you can see here that there's been a lot of public investment and supply, and so we're very interested in seeing how this increased supply is impacting what people select and what they're able to use. Most of the data comes from the 2012 National Study for Early Care and Education. These are 4 integrated surveys. They're publicly available. And we're getting ready to launch these data are at the University of Chicago through NORC. They're getting ready to launch a replication of this study in 2019. So we'll actually be able to compare improvements in early care and education over this period of 2012 into the next phase of the study. And what we do in terms of analyses is we're looking at low-income Hispanics compared to other low-income populations, specifically white and Black peers. We're also interested in providers who serve large numbers of Hispanic children versus those that serve fewer children. These are the dimensions that I'll report on today: utilization, needs, preferences, and search patterns. So in terms of challenging common assumption, there was a large bias in the literature that Hispanic families were really not interested in formal early care and education. I know I'm talking to a Tulsa sort of audience. You all have been the leaders for a long time in ECE access, but out there in the rest of the world, people really thought that Hispanic families wanted to keep their babies at home and were not interested in enrichment experiences. And we find a lot of evidence that that's just not accurate. We also find that there are more similarities with Hispanic families from low-income backgrounds to other groups. And we find this lack of cultural preference evidence in contemporary families. So here are the current utilization patterns that we're reporting, and you do see that we find differences when we break out immigrant households versus native-born households, that immigrants are using slightly less care, but that any US-born Latino family is really comparable to low-income white peers, and African-American families have been successful in accessing care that meets their needs for a long period of time, and you see high rates from that group. The participation gaps are larger when you look at infants and toddlers. So we're seeing more of a disparity here in terms of, this is the lowest group here, being from an immigrant household and having an infant and toddler at 37%, for example, compared to African Americans at 58%. The significant differences that you see are really between immigrant households, native households, and white families. Sorry, I'm going to go really fast, but if you want these data, you can contact me later. We also find that Hispanic children are as likely to participate in center-based care. And this has been the form of care that has been the most regulated and is of the highest quality and might be expected to provide that compensatory experience. And finally, we know that Hispanic children in ECE are also as likely to be in home-based care. And we've sort of been studying what happens to families to make them wind up in these different settings. The one part of the story is that most families are using multiple arrangements. And so they're not just going to a center-based program, but they're using that type of care in addition to other forms. Okay, I want to talk about the nature of work that parents are experiencing in Hispanic households. And these findings were very surprising to us. We find that non-standard hours of parental work are very common. About 75% of children in the sample, 0 to 5, with working parents, have some parent, at least one parent, working a non-standard schedule. And we also see, in terms of stress and coordination of this care, that about 50% of Hispanic working parents report very little notice of their work hours, and so this complicates everything around family routines, stability in the home, etc. And lastly, we find that most of these hours are happening really early in the morning or on the weekends, and that working an overnight shift is much less common. There's not a lot of ethnic racial differences, except that the short advance notice, the highest rates we see in immigrant households, and again, we think it's the nature of the work experiences that they have that are driving those experiences. Why does this matter in terms of supply? I couldn't resist one slide. There's not a lot of early care and education available to parents or non-parental care during the non-standard hours. And so you see here that which providers are open full-time and which providers are open on the evening and weekends is just not meeting the need of where the work schedules are coming from. So I think this is an area of implication if we have time to think further about. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to share some findings that we published about a year or two ago about do Hispanic families actually engage in search. And so these data are suggesting any parent that searched for care in the past 2 years. And what we see is that while they're interested in doing the search, they're not doing a search in a very robust way. And so when they do search, they consider fewer providers, and who they consider differs. They're also less likely to make a change of their circumstance after a search. So here are some graphs to support this. We see out of the people who searched, 35% of families reported engaging a search, and again, African Americans at much higher rates. All families were at 41%. So these are people who think they need care and they might be interested in pursuing it. These data show that Hispanic parents are considering fewer providers on the left, and that their search resulted in a change in care. White families reporting higher rates of being able to change care. Hispanic families in the orange bar the lowest. And so the reasons that people give for needing to change a care can be everything from childcare disruption, my provider stopped, closed up, my provider moved, to a parent's work schedule changing or moving in a community. There are a lot of different reasons why people need to change their care. And lastly, in the infant and toddler, I'm sort of building this evidence for you that infants and toddlers are really different. We have to pay attention to child age and our consideration of protective experiences. Families are considering different providers, and they are much less likely to be interested in center-based care. Nationally, only about 15% of low-income Hispanic families are served by this form of care. And so again, if this is the most regulated, highest quality environment for children, we have to be thinking about changes either to increasing those rates or making home-based care a little bit more robust in terms of developmental trajectories. So to summarize, utilization patterns are more similar than not across low-income Hispanic, white, and Black families, especially for the period of 3 to 5. So this really means that the public investment may have been paying off in terms of reducing the inequity in who gets these experiences. However, there's likely more work to do for the younger than 3 population. We're getting new information about Hispanic families' preferences, and so the main message may not to assume that families are only interested in one type of experience, and that what meets a family's need is likely much more heterogeneous and diverse than previously thought. We see that families want to have care in order to support their work needs and also to support their child's enrichment. Those are the top 2 reasons, but the robustness of the search process seems to be less rigorous for Hispanic families. We have some hypotheses about this. We think it has to do with administrative burden, language, and also fear of outsiders, and being open about working with community providers. I didn't show you data that suggests that relatives are a big source of care for Hispanic families. For some, that's true, but for many others, it's not. And so you cannot just rely on the relative explanation. And then finally, I just tried to highlight for you that maybe the nature of the work is challenging. I didn't talk anything about insurance, benefits, safety nets around work, but these factors are really important as well to consider. And so in terms of just thinking about some policy pieces, we're thinking a lot about how we're providing consumer education, The ways that we can reduce administrative burden for families. The new reforms for childcare subsidies have approved a much longer period of a year so that families do not have to keep recertifying if they have a change to their employment or a change in their work hours. And so that's really offered a level of stability and reducing the need for families to have to keep re-upping their vouchers to stay in childcare. In terms of unmet need, I would offer up that infants and toddlers are really a priority population to think more about, and the earlier adversity work suggests that we should be trying to think about these children even prenatally, as we just heard from their families. Supply, quality, and availability of care is very important. And then lastly, thinking about how families get care that meets their needs. I want to just end with a couple of profiles and some good news for Oklahoma. You're not on this slide, but you actually don't have a disparity in the number of children served by CCDF that are eligible. What this graph is showing you is the percent of children eligible in terms of the numbers of children that are actually receiving child care vouchers and participating. And so the largest gaps are here to the left in these states, and the smaller or no gap are on these states. These are the 13 states that are home to 80% of low-income Hispanic children. So Oklahoma would be over here in the no statistically significant gap. And another piece of good news is that we see that states are expanding to reduce administrative burden. Unfortunately, these are where my Georgia friends are going to give me my shout out. Georgia and North Carolina have a long way to go in terms of increasing access, but 11 states in our profile do provide provisions for people to apply for child care assistance via Spanish website or application, or have someone in the office to assist with that. Okay, so thank you very much.